I was so prepared for the transphobia that might come my way that I don't think I thought about as much the sexism and the misogyny that I would face.
Hello, I'm Bonnie Erbe, and welcome to the Contrary, which is normally a panel discussion with diverse views talking about issues in the news that affect women, families, and diverse communities. But we're continuing now with our series on female thought leaders, and we are so lucky today to have Sarah McBride, who is a regular panelist on the show also, but her day job is that she is the spokesperson for the Human Rights Campaign, which is the biggest gay LGBTQ NGO, I guess you would say, in Washington and in the United States. And you've been there for about a year. Before that, you were one of the first openly transgender people to work in the White House, right? Tell me what that was like.
Well, first off, it's wonderful to be back on the program and in this different format. So I came out as transgender in 2012 while I was serving as student body president at American University. And at the time, I really worried that my dreams and my identity were mutually exclusive. I feared that as someone who loved politics and government, that there really wasn't a place for someone like me in those fields. And so when I came out, one of the first things that I did actually was I applied for an internship at the White House. And there had never been a transgender staffer there. There had never been a transgender woman who worked there, an out transgender woman who worked there in any capacity, as far as people know. And so I applied for an internship, fortunately got the internship, and I was able for about 7 months to work there as the first trans person, trans woman to work there in any capacity. And even though it was an internship, it was an incredible opportunity to be able to walk into a place where so many decisions are made. It's an honor to be able to do it as someone whose identity hadn't been present in that building in that way before. And it comes with a responsibility, obviously, to represent a community that so often is ignored or so often is forgotten about. But the folks at the White House were incredible. They were amazing allies. And it's amazing, even just in 6 or 7 months, to see how conversations change when a person of a particular background is at the table, right? When folks at the White House have to see you in the hallway or have the pleasure of seeing you in the hallway or in meetings or at lunch, how the needs of people like you come to the forefront of their mind in decision-making processes or in prioritization. So it was an honor, it was a responsibility, and even as an intern, it was an incredible experience.
Do you think any of that had the impact of changing policies, changing government programs?
I think there's no question that when LGBTQ voices are heard, when trans people are at the table, it has even subtle differences. I think what my presence did, what the presence of Rafi Friedman Gerspan, who was later hired as the first trans staffer at the White House, it did have an impact on policy. There's no question that the previous administration, not this administration, the previous administration, has always been supportive of LGBTQ rights, was always supportive of trans rights too, but they were much more quiet about that support in the first term. And then it was really at the end of the first term, into the second term, that folks like me, folks like Rafi, started to become regulars at the White House on the day-to-day basis. And with that, there was a increase in vocal support. And again, I don't think it was me per se or Rafi or any of the out trans appointed officials individually, but rather our presence and our numbers, our growing numbers in the halls of the White House and the administration that did over time help to at least bring some more comfort and passion around these issues.
Did it feel weird to come from a city like DC, which has such an LGBTQ presence, where there are transgender people in all kinds of roles, and you see them all the time and go to the White House where there were none?
You sort of get used to being maybe the only person in the room. And we should certainly get to a place where it's not just one trans person or one person of color or one person with a disability in a room where these conversations are happening. We should have diverse and numerous diverse voices in a room. But I think you do, on an individual level, because of the barriers that exist, get used to being the only one in the room. So I wouldn't say it was jarring in that respect. And obviously, when I left the White House, you're still in the midst of this diverse, vibrant LGBTQ community in DC. But you know, when you're there, you do take on the responsibility of oftentimes educating people. You do have conversations that maybe you otherwise wouldn't have if you were one of many.
Do you ever get sick of that? Having to explain yourself?
You know, I think for me it's my job, and I recognize that that's sort of what I'm here for, and as an advocate, that's what I'm here for. But I think there's no question that it's a challenge for anyone to have to repeatedly sort of prove their humanity, justify their humanity, justify their existence and their worth, and the fact that they should be treated with dignity.
Well, wait, I'm confused though. Please explain when you say be treated with dignity and explain themselves. What kind of explaining? I thought you were just talking about maybe how it was when you transition, you know, what it's like to transition. But are there other things that people ask you?
Well, I mean, I think first off, obviously, the White House was an incredibly inclusive, supportive environment, so the conversations were always very positive conversations, and I never had a conversation I wasn't willing to have. But out in the world, transgender people obviously are facing pretty significant legislative attacks. We're facing new attacks by the Trump administration, and obviously there's a lot of hate, and with that, discrimination and violence. And you know, when you have to go out and you know, justify your ability to use a restroom, or when you have to go out and prove that you are who you are, and assert time and time again, listen, I'm a person, and that is in and of itself obviously a difficult thing to have to do time and time again, to reinforce time and time again that other people have a difficult time empathizing with you is a difficult thing to have to do. I take that responsibility, and I'm happy to do it as an advocate. I think for me, what's important is that other transgender people don't have to do that all the time, that I can help with the privileges that I have those conversations so that maybe they don't have to on a day-to-day basis.
Let's turn to your personal story. You're from Delaware. Yeah. How young were you when you knew, and how did you know?
That's a great question. I've known my entire life. As early as I can remember, I knew who I was. I didn't always know that there were other people like me. I didn't know that there was necessarily something I could do about it. But I always knew that I was a girl. And you know, it's difficult to explain how one knows. It's not necessarily a sort of train of thought that exists, that sort of intellectual exercise. It's more of a gut piece of knowledge. I think it's difficult for people who are not transgender. It's called they're called cisgender people. It's difficult for non-transgender people to fully empathize with the experience of having a gender identity that differs from your sex assigned at birth.
Sure.
It's not obviously an experience that most people have, and I think for me the closest thing that I can compare that experience to is a constant feeling of homesickness, that unwavering ache in the pit of your stomach that only goes away when you know you're home. And for most people with geographic homesickness, that dissipates as you get used to your new environment. For me, it only got worse over time. It only increased over time, and that pain in my self, that ache in the pit of my stomach, it would only go away when I was able to live as myself and be able to be seen and affirmed as myself. And so I think it's difficult for folks to wrap their mind around that, but I always had that feeling. And then I remember when I was about 10, I was watching a sitcom, and there was a guest character who was transgender, not played by a transgender person, played by a non-transgender woman. And I remember when that character came on and the sort of backstory was explained, I remember at 10 turning to my mother and saying, is that real? Can people do that? Can people, have a gender that's different from what everyone thinks? And my mother said yes, and she explained that they're called transgender people. And I remember my heart dropping, because even though I had just been given this incredible piece of information, I also in that instance knew that this character in the show was a joke. And when you're 10 years old, you know a lot of things. You don't know necessarily a lot of things, but you know that you don't want to be a joke. And I remember looking at my mom just going, oh my God, I'm going to have to tell you this someday, and you're going to be so disappointed. And
so you had not discussed it with her before. Did
No.
you discuss it then at age 10?
I didn't. I kept it inside because, again, I think what is so clear from an early age is that, you're told you're a boy, should like X, Y, or Z thing, you should identify in X, Y, or Z way, and there's no deviation, right? And that's one of the reasons why I think the fight for LGBTQ and trans equality are inextricably linked with the fight for gender equality, because it's this notion that we should move past the idea that one perception at birth, the sex you are assigned, should dictate who you are, who you love, how you act, and what you do. And so from an early age, all of those messages from society were so crystal clear that I knew it was not something that I could express without fear of bullying at school or, without fear of disappointing my parents. So I kept it inside. And really it was only at the point of college where that pain, that homesickness became so great. And I think my confidence became, high enough that between those two, it got to a point where I just said, I need to come out and I need to take these steps. And I told my parents.
And how did they react?
They were incredibly supportive. When I came out,
You think they knew before you
No.
told them? No.
No, they were totally shocked. And, at the time also, it wasn't really in the public consciousness. But I did a decent job of, not of only giving off so many hints, of only doing so much that it would start to raise eyebrows or raise questions, that I tried to conform as much as possible. And
did you play sports? Did you play football?
Didn't go that far. And if I had, I would have been terrible at it. So I didn't try that. But I wasn't a particularly gender nonconforming in my presentation person. And so I conformed quite a bit, and so they were pretty surprised. But they said from the start, we love you and we support you. But it was difficult for them, as I think it is for a lot of parents, particularly of frankly, older young people and adults, because you begin to mourn what feels like the loss of this child that you knew. And so for a couple weeks, I sort of lived through my parents mourning what felt like to them a death. But then as I began to transition and as they, got to see me as my authentic self, they realized that the wrapping paper was a little bit different, but that the child that they loved with all of the same interests, all of the same hobbies and the same sense of humor and the same passions, that child was still there. And realized obviously that I wasn't going anywhere.
Let's talk a little bit about what it's like having been born into maybe what a doctor misidentified as a boy's body, and then becoming a girl as you were at 17, 18. Mm-hmm. What struck you most about changing from being treated as a guy to being treated as a woman?
It's a question that we're having, I think, more and more within the community of how we talk about that, and what are those experiences like. And I can only speak from my own personal experience as someone who appeared relatively gender conforming as what was perceived as a guy, and then someone who transitioned then. And I was so prepared for the transphobia that might come my way that I don't think I thought about as much the sexism and the misogyny that I would face. I was always someone who was very aware of phobias and isms out in the world, and I was very aware, obviously, of sexism and misogyny. And obviously, as I sort of alluded to, sexism and misogyny in this world taught me from a young age that, you know, you shouldn't identify as a girl. You shouldn't want to be a girl. And so obviously, sexism and misogyny interacted with my life in a way that wasn't the case for necessarily other people who were perceived as boys. But, you know, walking down the street as myself after transitioning, or going into a workplace, or going into any kind of environment, being perceived as a woman versus being perceived as a man, it is jarring. And, you know, I think I didn't fully, for instance, wrap my mind around just how disempowering it would feel to have a stranger feel entitled to make a comment about my body, whether negative or positive, right? That sort of jarring experience of street harassment is something that's difficult to comprehend until you've experienced it. The experience of maybe having your voice ignored or your opinions talked down to by men out in the world. You know, those are experiences that I didn't have before that obviously I have now, and that is jarring, and it really, I think, for me, highlighted just how pervasive sexism and misogyny is. That, you know, every decision a woman has to make, you're sort of navigating the world. You're navigating the world as to sort of what streets you can go down at what time, how you get your opinion heard, how you get your voice heard in a way that men don't have to. And you know, I think for me that was eye-opening.
Does it happen within the LGBTQ community or movement?
Even marginalized communities experience different prejudices or biases in their own communities, right? No one is free of implicit bias. No one is free from those types of prejudices. So I think it exists everywhere, whether you're in an LGBTQ space or whether you're in just sort of the general world.
Talking to other people who've gone from female to male, do they feel really empowered?
In the conversations that I've had with individuals who were assigned female at birth but are men, that experience of living in the world perceived as a woman and then going into the world sort of benefiting from male privilege in so many ways, I think they're able similarly to see that that juxtaposition really so clearly outlines and demonstrates the pervasiveness of sexism and misogyny in the world. And one of the reasons why, you know, so many of the trans men that I know are such great feminists, because they, you know, even though they're in the world benefiting, you know, from, in many ways, male privilege, you know, they have seen what it's like on the other end of sexism and misogyny.
You mentioned that even in the commercial world, sexism is very ingrained. Explain that, please.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's everything we do is so often gendered. You go to the grocery store, you go to a convenience store, and you've got, you know, blue things for boys and men, and pink things for girls and women. And even if it's an identical product, the pink thing will cost more than the blue thing. And it's both arbitrary, but just really demonstrates just how ingrained and pervasive these stereotypes and expectations are within our society.
What would you say to women who say, you started life as a male, mm-hmm. and now you're representing women's voices, and they don't feel that's fair because you've had the experience of being a male, at least up until about age 17.
Womanhood isn't a measure of privilege. If that were the case, then a girl who's 15 is less of a woman than a woman who's 70, or a woman who's white is less of a woman than a woman who's black. Our measure of womanhood is not based on privilege. Our measure of womanhood is based on a collective identity that shouldn't be based on any single fact. That shouldn't be based on any single piece of biology, because we shouldn't be reducing women to their biology. We shouldn't be reducing women to a body part. We shouldn't be reducing women to the single expectation that's established at birth by a doctor. We know that that's not how gender works. We know that because of the experience of women throughout society. We know that because of the medical community that overwhelmingly acknowledges the reality of gender identity as a aspect of human diversity that includes gender identity that may differ from a sex assigned at birth. And we know that because throughout time and millennia, transgender people have existed. And that's a fact about human diversity. And we should embrace that diversity. We should say, no woman can speak for every woman, but let's have all of these voices heard, because all of these different voices can contribute to this conversation about what women need and just how pervasive sexism and misogyny is.
What's next for the LGBTQ movement?
Obviously, we've seen historic progress on the issue of LGBTQ rights over the last several years. Obviously, the marriage equality decision was a monumental moment for our community and our country and our path towards a more perfect union. But there's obviously a lot of work that remains. As you alluded to, LGBTQ people still lack clear and explicit protections from discrimination in the workplace, in housing, in the public square, in a majority of states and at the federal level. And so something that we need right now is LGBTQ people need clear, comprehensive non-discrimination protections so that we can not just live but thrive in this society. We need states to pass them, we need cities to pass them, and we need the federal government to pass the Equality Act, which would afford nationwide protections to LGBTQ people throughout daily life. Discrimination is one challenge, but also violence remains a very real threat for a lot of LGBTQ people, particularly trans women of color. This year, we've seen at least 10 transgender women of color murdered in the United States. Last year, we saw over 20. This is an epidemic of violence that is fostered by the toxic mix of homophobia, transphobia, misogyny, and racism. And that when you put those prejudices together, it oftentimes leads to fatal violence. So it's violence that we need to take very seriously in our society. And then beyond that, even with Donald Trump in the White House, even with some hostile state legislatures across the country, we still work to push equality forward by opening hearts and minds in houses of worship, in homes, in workplaces and schools across the country. Because we know that change doesn't just come from laws, it also comes from the bottom up by people knowing someone who's LGBTQ, by people loving someone who's LGBTQ, and creating ripples of change that save lives and improve our world.
Is it going to be harder under this administration, the Trump administration, than it would have been under the Obama administration or the Hillary Clinton administration if there had been one?
We had in Barack Obama a president who was more supportive of LGBTQ rights than any president in American history. And
even he changed in office.
And even he
evolved.
He
didn't start out.
Well, and he had always been a supporter of equality, but he did evolve on the issue of marriage equality specifically. But we saw so much progress under his administration and during his time in office. Progress that was both directly related to his administration, but also progress that was broader than his administration. But there's no question that he helped foster that change, that he helped demonstrate through his own evolution that it's okay to change. And he obviously had an administration that changed policies, pushed laws that made the world more safe and secure for LGBTQ people. And it's obviously true that in Donald Trump we have someone who, despite saying the letters LGBTQ at the Republican convention, is hostile to all of the major issues that face the transgender and LGBTQ community. He endorsed the right of states like North Carolina, the ability of states like North Carolina to discriminate. He has chosen in his vice president and in a number of cabinet secretaries individuals who have proactively supported discrimination. And he obviously rescinded guidance that helped protect transgender students within our schools. And so it does present more challenges. And this is a hostile administration when it comes to LGBTQ rights. But that hostility only reinforces the importance of this work and requires us to redouble our efforts and continue to push equality forward, particularly when it comes to opening hearts and changing minds.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was so enlightening. I really appreciate your time and giving us your time to talk about this topic. That's our interview with Sarah McBride. Thank you for watching. And please make sure to follow us on Twitter at Bonnie Erbe or at To the Contrary, and visit our PBS website, pbs.org/To the Contrary. And whether you agree or think to the contrary, please join us next time.